I am thrilled this morning to introduce Michael Wear, who's one of my good friends. He is a Cultura Fellow with the Martin Institute, as well as the founder, president, and CEO of the Center for Christianity and Public Life, a nonpartisan, nonprofit institution based in the nation's capital with the mission to contend for the credibility of Christian resources in public life for the public good. For well over a decade, Michael has served as a trusted resource and advisor for a range of civic leaders on matters of faith and public life, including as a White House and presidential campaign staffer. Michael's next book, The Spirit of Our Politics, Spiritual Formation and the Renovation of Public Life, will be released in January. Michael is thoughtful and sincere and just has a whole lot to say, so I hope that you will really lean in and listen this morning. Please join me in welcoming Michael Wear.
Well, I am just thrilled to be here. I love this place. I love this community, and it's an honor, so thank you. I'm looking forward to sharing with you all today. Religion and politics are the two topics you're not supposed to discuss at the dinner table. Y'all heard this phrase? Have you ever stopped to ask yourself why this is? It wasn't until recently I came to think that the saying is generally true, but for opposing reasons. People don't want to talk about politics because they hold their views too tightly. Too much of their identity is staked in politics. People don't want to talk about religion because they are haunted by the idea that they do not stake their lives in the spiritual things enough, that God takes up too little space in their life. I want to talk to you today about the space politics is taking up in your life. I want to talk about the space Jesus takes up in your life. I want to talk with you about the kind of person you are and the kind of person our politics needs. First, let's talk about the kind of politics we have. In October of 2020, 15 scholars from a range of fields came together to issue a dire warning about the particular kind of polarization we have today. They called it political sectarianism. Political sectarianism is the tendency to adopt a moralized identification with one political group and against another. It's upheld by three pillars. Othering, which is, quote, the tendency to view opposing partisans as essentially different or alien to oneself. Aversion, the tendency to dislike and distrust opposing partisans. And moralization, the tendency to view opposing partisans as iniquitous or sinful as opposed to merely wrong-headed. What does political life look like when it runs on the fuel of aversion, othering, and misplaced moralization? Here's what the scholars said. They said that we've come to a point at which out-party hate has become more powerful than in-party love as a predictor of voting behavior. In other words, political hatred has become so profound that it outstrips many individuals' desire to actually help themselves, not to mention loftier motivations like advancing the common good. Political sectarianism is a state in which we hate our opponents so much that we'll do harm to ourselves and our interests before we concede anything to them. That's not all, of course. Yes, in our politics, we hate others, often without merit, but politics also has us fearful, stressed, exhausted. For many, politics is an ultimate thing. For many, politics has become an idol. One response to the state of our politics might be to distance ourselves from it, to turn up our noses or throw up our hands, but we can't do this. We must not do it because politics is important. We literally cannot do away with it. Wherever there are people in community, there will be politics. And as citizens in political communities with representative systems of government, we're not only affected by politics, we have responsibility for it. We should also recognize the tremendous good that government does and that our political process produces even now. Politics requires our service because political decisions greatly impact the well-being of human beings made in the image of God, as well as the world in which we live. Political decisions shape how we travel, what we eat, how we are cared for when we're sick, how we make money, how we gather in public, how we define what's legal and illegal, how justice is served, what poverty entails, what technology we have, and on and on. The Christian's responsibility for our politics is special. We share with our fellow citizens, Christians and others, the responsibility in and for our politics in the eyes of the law. And yet Christians are also called by God to be a blessing to the cities and communities in which we've been placed. This calling does not bestow special status or privilege. It is a call to service. When Christians are grounded in the gospel, when our security and identity is based in Christ, then we are freed up to go to politics not to play out our hatreds and fears and not just to pursue our own self-interest, but to advance justice and affirm human dignity. T.S. Eliot described the current human endeavor as that of finding a system of order so perfect that we will not have to be good. But I have come to understand that the kind of politics we have is not just the sum total of our policy preferences and plans. The kind of politics we have has much to do with the kind of people we are. The question then is, what kind of a person are you? And this is not just a political question. This is the question. We answer the question for ourselves wherever we are and in whatever we do. You answer it in your relationships. You answer it when you think no one is watching. You answer it as you interact with students and professors and bosses. Unfortunately, for some of you, you answer it by how you treat freshmen. Are you still awake? Okay. And yes, we answer it as we act in politics, as we vote, as we discuss and think about political issues. You are not one person when you think about or talk about politics and another person in your personal life. Thoughts, feelings, and actions that are characteristic for a person when they are dealing with politics are not quarantined off from the rest of the person. If you are the kind of person who lies during political arguments to get your way, you are the kind of person who lies during political arguments to get your way. If you are the kind of person who wishes ill to fall upon those you disagree with politically, you are that kind of person. Dallas Willard defined joy as a pervasive and constant sense of well-being. Joy is a pervasive and constant sense of well-being. How many of you would describe our current political climate as full of a pervasive and constant sense of well-being? How many of you would describe your own approach to politics in that way? Might it be a problem that so many of us don't see politics as a place for joy? Where else in our lives do we think the way of Jesus isn't quite realistic? Spiritual formation, Willard wrote, without regard to any specifically religious context or tradition, is the process by which the human spirit or will is given a definite form or character. This process happens to everyone. We each become a certain kind of person in the depths of our being, gaining a specific type of character. Now, this is a really important thing to understand. It's important to understand as you think about yourself. Your spirit has a character, and it is being shaped and directed every day. And again, spiritual formation is not something you can just turn off when you're thinking about money or your relationships or politics and turn back on in moments of convenience. But understanding that we all have a spiritual formation is also important as we think of others in our public life and politics. They too have been shaped and are being shaped by our politics. And in some measure, our actions, how we approach politics, is influencing their formation. It's shaping their souls. It takes great vision to look out at our politics and to see what Parker Palmer saw when he said that we have a politics of broken-hearted people. I think that's exactly right. C.S. Lewis was saying something like this when he said in his famous sermon, The Weight of Glory, that, quote, "It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long we are, in some degree, helping each other to one or other of these destinations. And it is in the light of these overwhelming possibilities, it is with the awe and the circumspection proper to them that we should conduct all our dealings with one another, all friendships, all loves, all play, all politics. Christian spiritual formation has this in its sights, that we might conduct all our dealings in light of God's reality and God's truth. Christian spiritual formation is the spirit-driven process of forming the inner world of the human self in such a way that it becomes like the inner being of Christ himself. It is focused entirely on Jesus. Its goal is an obedience or conformity to Christ that arises out of an inner transformation accomplished through purposeful interaction with the grace of God in Christ. So before we proceed any further, I just want to recap what we've covered so far. First, our politics is a reflection of the state of our souls. And politics shapes us just as our activity and thoughts and feelings regarding politics flow from the kind of person we are. Second, though we must be aware of the dangers of politics, which are not totally unlike the dangers in many other areas of life, we cannot be removed from politics because of the call of faithfulness, the nature of government, and the love of our neighbors. And then third, because the kind of people we are has much to do with the kind of politics we have. Spiritual formation is central to civic renewal. I want to tell you a story. In 1986, Robert Coles wrote The Moral Life of Children. In the book, he describes his theories about why children behave the way they do, and he talks about the id, the ego, and the superego, how they interact with one another. And yet his theories were confounded by one little girl named Ruby Bridges. Have any of you heard of Ruby Bridges before? Raise hands. No one. So this is going to be entirely new information. At age 6, Ruby Bridges was the black student who initiated school integration at the William Frantz School. The school was integrated as part of the response to the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board, which was decided in 1954, just months before Ruby's birth. By 1960, integration was required in Louisiana by a federal court order, but it continued to face intense resistance from both public officials and white citizens. For months, Ruby was escorted by federal marshals as she made her way to her local public school. This is a photo displaying that. For nearly a full school year, Ruby was the sole student at William Frantz as white families boycotted, refusing to send their children to school with a black student. Every day, marshals escorted Ruby through a mob of angry people who would curse her, shout racial slurs, and hurl death threats. As the story of what Ruby was doing in Louisiana became better known, Robert Coles traveled to New Orleans to meet her. He wanted to understand how a little girl could do what she was doing. And after a period of trying to apply various psychological theories to explain Ruby's behavior, Coles came upon an interesting bit of information from one of the teachers at the school who reported on the scene. Here's what she said. She said, "I was standing in the classroom looking out the window, and I saw Ruby coming down the street with the federal marshals on both sides of her. The crowd was there shouting as usual. A woman spat at Ruby but missed. Ruby smiled at her. A man shook his fist at her. Ruby smiled at him. Then she walked up the stairs and she stopped and turned around and smiled one more time. You know what she told one of the marshals? She told him she prays for those people, the ones in that mob, every night before she goes to sleep." So Coles had to follow up on this. So he asked Ruby how she could pray for these people. And Ruby told him, "I go to church every Sunday, and we're told to pray for everyone, even the bad people, and so I do." Coles continued to press Ruby so he could continue with his analysis, and she told him, "They keep coming and saying the bad words, but my mama says they'll get tired after a while, and then they'll stop coming. They'll stay home. The minister came to our house, and he said the same thing, and not to worry, and I don't. The minister said God is watching and he won't forget because he never does. The minister says if I forgive the people and smile at them and pray for them, God will keep a good eye on everything and he'll be our protection." Coles thought he sensed doubt in Ruby's voice as she said this, and so he asked her if she believed the minister And Ruby replied, "Oh, yes, I'm sure God knows what's happening. He's got a lot to worry about, but there is bad trouble here, and he can't help but notice. He may not rush to do anything, not right away, but there will come a day like you hear in church." Remember, Coles continued his psychological analysis, but couldn't make much headway with his existing theories. Years later, he recalled conversations with his wife about Ruby and reflected that the more he sought to impose some scientific or psychological theory on Ruby and others he studied, the more, quote, the more his wife kept pointing to the acts of these boys and girls, the deeds they managed. Before you're tempted to hand-wave away what Ruby did, I hope you'll consider that Ruby might be just the kind of person Jesus had in mind when he said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." Remember, it was Ruby, confident in the promises of God, who did the thing for which others only had talk and fancy explanations. The power of the knowledge that Ruby had about God is most evident not in theory, but in her action, what she did, and that's much more difficult to dismiss. And so what do you really believe about God and his world? How might that knowledge lead you to act in ways which confound the upside-down ways of our politics? Where you are right now. What might it look like for you to bring Jesus with you to public things in such a way that the startling answer to explain your behavior is genuinely, "I believe in Jesus"? When I think of Ruby Bridges, I think of a Norman Rockwell painting of her titled "The Problem We All Live With." The painting depicts little Ruby in a white dress with a bow in her hair, carrying school supplies. She's marching, surrounded by 4 federal marshals. On the wall behind her is a graffitied racial epithet and the letters KKK etched into the wall, with the remains of a thrown tomato on the sidewalk alongside the wall. I think of this painting because when I worked in the White House, the painting was displayed right outside the Oval Office. I would walk by it on my way to the Roosevelt Room or the Oval. Sometimes if I had a moment of quiet, I walked over just to look at it. Others, too, were moved by this painting. If you were going to meet with the president, you might be seated right outside the Oval Office waiting for the president's current meeting to wrap up. And so you'd look at little Ruby. Everyone who meets with the president has something burning in their heart that they want to say that they think is important. But even the boldest can wilt under the pressure. The Oval Office is extremely intimidating. It's oval for a reason. The door closes, and you can no longer tell if there's a way out of that room. You just think, I may never be seen again. The presidency can be intimidating. But I know stories of people who, as they felt the pressure, unsure of themselves and their qualifications to do what they had been called to do, what people were counting on them to do, they looked at Ruby Bridges and thought, if she could do what she did, certainly I can have the courage to stand for what I believe is right. Imagine that. The faithfulness of a 6-year-old, Ruby Bridges, inspiring adults 50 years later who had an audience with the president. I just want to close with this. A few years ago, I received a call from a friend. Now, this friend has a significantly different approach to politics than I do, though we agree on much, including human rights and religious freedom. When my friend called, I expected that she would want to talk about one of these issues, but instead she called on a completely different matter. She said, "Michael, I know this is a little out of the blue, but I was hoping you might find the time to meet with my daughter. She's been deeply troubled by what's happening in our politics. And while I've tried to explain it, she doesn't understand my position on Trump. She's no longer attending church, and she's struggling in her faith. I want her to meet with a faithful Christian who just has a different approach to politics than I do. Michael, to be honest, I no longer care all that much about the future of my daughter's politics. I just want her to start going to church with her family again." Oddly, perhaps this conversation was one of the most hopeful I've had in recent years. Here was someone who had invested their professional life in political advocacy, but who nonetheless was willing to set aside their politics out of love for their daughter. How many of us would do the same? How many of us would say we'd prefer to lose in our political ambitions if it meant others might draw closer to Jesus? How many of us would say we'd prefer to sacrifice political advantage if it meant we might draw nearer to Jesus? I know I won't be talking to everyone in the room when I say this, but I know I'll be talking to many of you. I want to encourage those of you who are struggling right now. I know this has been a difficult period for many of you. You have reason to be disappointed in our culture. You look out at our politics and see people claiming things in the name of God that God himself would not claim. Perhaps you have someone in your life that has not given you the answer that my friend had for her daughter. It is hard to have people in your life whose desire to make their point seems greater than their desire for you to draw near to Jesus. Can I encourage you to not let your disappointments in others keep you from bringing your greatest hopes and longings and pains and loves to Jesus? He is fit to bear those burdens. Look past those on the right and left who use the name of Jesus as a pretext, as fodder, as cover for their abuse. And look instead to Jesus himself. Over and above the clanging cymbals and the daunting hypocrisy, the false idols and the broken promises, Jesus' life remains clear and available to all who earnestly seek him. He is the founder and perfecter of our faith. Jesus is, as Willard wrote, simply the brightest spot in the human scene. And so keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, the bright one. Go to Jesus with your heart. And then go out with Jesus at your side, out into the world, out into our politics, as a blessing to those you come across, for the good of the public and for the glory of God. May the Lord bless and keep you. Look forward to talking with many of you throughout the day here. Thank you.